Thank you, Scotty. I'm really humbled by those words, and I want everybody in this room to know that anything we've done here, we owe to our professional staff and the support of the city government and the support of our board members and the support of visitors like you, as they say on PBS, of listeners like you, viewers like you who come to our learning lunches. So we deeply appreciate the support you've given to our learning lunches. This is one of these times that my wife always likes to remind me that you don't have to tell the group every single thing that you know about something, that you accumulated over the years like a crazed genealogist. You shouldn't do that. Just get up there, tell them a little bit about it, and then sit down. So I'll try not to show you every single image of Will Armbrecht that I've accumulated, and I certainly won't try to show you all the documents, but I'll show you a few of them. When Will Armbrecht arrived in Mobile as a teenager in 1888, he already had 3 strikes against him. First, he was a Yankee, born in Port Chester, New York in 1874. Second, his father, Caesar Armbrecht, was a veteran of the Civil War, but he wore the blue. That was the second problem he had. And third, the Armbrechts were Republicans. At that time in Mobile or any other Deep South city, any one of these deficiencies in one's biography would have been difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. But due to Will's strong personal work ethic, tenacity, courage, and integrity, he overcame all of those so-called deficiencies. He pursued a slightly circuitous route to the U.S. Attorney's position. His parents, Caesar and Anna Armbrecht, were nurturing parents, and young Will grew up in a household where learning was treasured. His father, Caesar, personally tutored young Will and his younger brother, Charles, in English, German, French, Latin, and Greek, and a lot of lessons of life. At age 14, Will became an office boy in Lyman H. Fates' law office and studied stenography in the evening. He subsequently moved on to a stenographer's job with the Mobile and Ohio Railroad Company. E.L. Russell, the M&O's vice president and general counsel, quickly recognized the young man's potential and let him read law in his office. Will Armbrecht was admitted to the bar in June 1897 and then served as the M&O's personal injury attorney for 3 years. Now, just to show you what Will was all about, in 1912, when he was a special attorney for the Chamber of Commerce and Business League, working for the city of Mobile, he won a railroad rate discrimination case against his former employer, the M&O. He never let any personal feelings or any political influence determine his legal work. In December 1897, he married Annabelle Patterson. Over the next 11 years, they had 2 sons and 2 daughters. After leaving his railroad job in 1900, Armbrecht launched his private legal career. His Republican affiliation and his avoidance of the bitter political schism between the party's lily whites and black and tans led President Theodore Roosevelt to appoint him at age 29 in 1904 as the U.S. Attorney for Alabama's Southern District. I don't know for sure, but I think he might have been probably the youngest U.S. Attorney in the United States at that time. President Taft, oh, by the way, this is a picture. Will Armbrecht is somewhere in this picture. I just haven't found him yet. This is when Teddy Roosevelt visited Mobile in 1905. And I'm certain that Will is somewhere in that crowd, because I think that's the customs building that TR is speaking in front of, and that's where Will Armbrecht's office was. At any rate, he was close to TR. He also was close to his rotundancy, as he was often known, William Howard Taft. And in 1908, William Howard Taft reappointed Will as the U.S. Attorney. We could spend hours talking about just his service as U.S. Attorney. He successfully prosecuted a number of important cases, including peonage in Monroe County, terrorist activities and night riding in Baldwin County, Mississippi timberlands depredation, and also an interstate wholesale jewelers fraud that was headquartered in Mobile. But perhaps his proudest moment as U.S. Attorney came in his breaking up of the notorious Honduran lottery syndicate in Louisiana, which had plagued the state's politics and economy since Reconstruction. These cases became important additions to young Will's growing resume, and he frequently discussed these over the years. But one case that he apparently never mentioned again evolved from an horrific event which occurred in Mobile on January 23rd, 1909. Shortly after 1 a.m., about 30 heavily armed masked men casually strolled into the unlocked Mobile County Jail and removed a prisoner named Richard Robertson, an African-American carpenter charged with murdering Deputy Sheriff Philip Thatch and wounding a second deputy, W.N. McCarran. Robertson himself had been seriously wounded during the recent shootout with the two deputies. The story I'm about to tell took place literally within walking distance of this building right in front of Christ Episcopal Church. The mob carried Robertson to the corner of St. Emmanuel and Church Streets. And at this time, this part of town was a residential area, so there were houses along St. Emmanuel. When Robertson began to scream, they shot him 3 times, stripped off his bloody clothing, and hanged him from a towering oak tree near Christ Church. When a terrified woman living on St. Emmanuel Street telephoned Central Police Headquarters to report hearing gunshots in the neighborhood, the night duty officer casually informed her that they were lynching Robertson and she should go back to bed. A half an hour later, by 1:30 a.m., the mob had dispersed from the scene, several of them leaving in automobiles, which was a key piece of evidence later, because in 1909, there weren't many automobiles in Mobile. An hour later, 2 policemen arrived and cut down Robertson's battered corpse from the tree. This is a picture from the newspaper. The arrow points to a Maltese cross where the body was hanging. Before dawn, a hastily convened coroner's jury ruled that the victim had died from hanging after being wounded, quote, by parties unknown to this jury. This was the first of many blatant lies told in the coming days by public officials and eyewitnesses. There's even some evidence that members of the coroner's jury were in the lynch mob too. Richard Robertson's brutal murder was the first lynching in the city of Mobile since Reconstruction. However, 2 young African-American men had been lynched near Plateau in 1906, and a third nearby, almost identical spot at Magazine Point in 1907. As long as such atrocities occurred outside the city limits, Mobile's public officials and civic boosters, particularly men like Irwin Craighead, who also hangs on this wall to my right there, they like to blame these atrocities on the so-called rural lawless element. In other words, the rednecks in the county, and not the so-called respectable people downtown. But this was a real problem in this case, because Robertson was murdered in a quiet downtown residential neighborhood dominated by Christ Episcopal Church, only 2 blocks from the Central Police Headquarters, an area where police officers walked their beats around the clock. But there were no policemen there that night. The first 2 policemen were the ones that arrived to cut him down. Attorney Harry Pillins exclaimed, "If this be suffered, we are reduced to savagery and anarchy." His son and law partner, Palmer Pillins, recalled over 60 years later, "We thought we were immune from that." The Mobile Daily Register's Irvin Craighead, same picture, also weighed in. And remember, before I read you this quote, Craighead was one of the most racially moderate people in Mobile at that time. This is what Craighead said in the paper. "It's not the Negro murderer that is to be defended, but the majesty of the law that guarantees to every accused person, no matter how base the act, an open and fair trial." On January 24th, 1909, several ministers delivered excoriating sermons on this latest episode of lawlessness in Mobile. The Reverend H.H. McNeil, the respected pastor of St. Francis Street Methodist Church, asserted, "We stand today with another chapter of shame and disgrace added to the fair name of our city by the Gulf." He described jailer Hugh Gillis's account of the so-called storming of the prison as a farce or burlesque, even giving the mob a certificate of good character for their efficiency and orderliness. 2 days later, on January 26th, after his impassioned sermon, McNeil was opening his mail that morning, and he found that he'd received 2 threatening letters. Although the original letters that he had haven't survived, we have a typescript of one of them. And this is not going to be an eye test. I'm not going to ask everybody in the back of the room to try to read this. This letter was signed by the so-called Committee of 100. And the writer essentially acknowledges that he had participated in the 1907 lynching of an African American. He doesn't name him, but it was Mose Dorset, also at Plateau. And then later on in the letter, he threatens McNeil with the same fate. Now, another threatening letter was sent to the Mobile Daily Item, and we do have the original of that. And for all of you who watch a lot of crime programs on TV, let me add that in 1909, fingerprint analysis and handwriting forensics were still in their infancy in law enforcement circles. So if you're imagining these law enforcement people handling these materials with gloves and putting them in plastic bags as evidence, that didn't happen here. So the chain of evidence for these letters was rudimentary at best. Nevertheless, and notice this one too, if you can read this all the way in the back, notice that they actually signed it lynchers. I'm going to highlight that for you. There we go. Lynchers with quotation marks around it. Spelling is not very good in this letter, but it's pretty much like the typescript letter that I showed you. The threat is there. We don't want to have to do this again, the mob leader claims. So stop spouting off all that hot air from the pulpit. If not, this is going to happen to you. I mean, that's about as clear a threat as anybody could ever send through the public mail. Well, Reverend McNeil took the letters to Will Armbrecht's office on the 3rd floor of the U.S. Customs House. After carefully examining the letters, Armbrecht spent the rest of the day studying federal and state criminal statutes and privately conferring with a number of the leading lawyers and judges in Mobile, including the U.S. District Judge Harry Toolman on the left, and Joseph Carlos Rich, an attorney, former alderman and mayor of Mobile, and City Court Judge Oliver J. Sims, son of the famous Raphael. Now, I put Palmer Pillins in there too, the law partner of Harry Pillins, because I'm not sure at what point Palmer began sharing all this information about the case, but it was fairly early. This was back in the days when, if you've ever seen any later pictures of Palmer Pillins, or some of y'all remember him since he lived so long, he actually had hair in those days. That tells you how young he was then, in his 20s. So anyway, then Armbrecht sat down at his typewriter, and apparently, even though he had a secretary in the U.S. Attorney's Office, he hammered out this letter himself, as best I can tell. He hammered out a 4-page, single-spaced letter to the U.S. Attorney General, Charles Bonaparte. And when I found this, I'm not going to show you this letter because it's in a really faded condition, but when I found that letter 40 years ago, it was still smoking. I mean, the emotion that he put into that letter, it was almost hot to the touch as you read it, because there was so much emotion he put into that letter. He was angry when he wrote that letter. He first provided a detailed chronology of the lynching, and then he told the Attorney General, "I want to impress upon the department," meaning Justice Department, "the idea which is prevalent here, that no investigation worthy of the name investigation can possibly be hoped for from either the Sheriff's Department or the City Police Force, because overwhelming evidence indicates that the mob had the passive, if not the active cooperation of both departments." He then acknowledged something that will be kind of shocking to us today. He said, "While federal courts have no jurisdiction in matters of lynching," that's a quote from the letter, "he was exploring possible scenarios for federal intervention in the case, if not directly, at least on the periphery. His consultation with Judge Toolman," on the left, "yielded a so-called first blush opinion that Section 3893 of the revised statutes of the U.S. was not applicable to this case because despite the abusive, threatening language of the letters, they arrived after the lynching and thus did not incite murder, assassination, or arson," which is a real thin legal hair to split there. But Armbrecht's session with Judge Sims produced another possible legal pathway into the case for the government. Judge Sims believed that the act of mailing the letters violated Section 6218 of the 1907 Criminal Code of the state of Alabama, which designated that postal communications of a threatening or abusive nature which tend to provoke a breach of the peace constitute a criminal act. So, thus Armbrecht concluded that there was clearly a violation of state statutes, and therefore he felt like U.S. postal investigators and Justice Department agents could seek and secure evidence of a violation of a state law whenever the federal laws are involved, and in this case, federal postal laws. He could then turn this evidence over to state authorities for possible litigation. And he even went further and recommended to the Attorney General by name 1 postal inspector and 2 Justice Department special agents that he wanted assigned to this case. And he said this, Will said this, "We need first-class men who do not come from this section, and especially men who can mingle with people of some prominence." And he mentioned at that point in the letter, "I have it on good authority that several of the mob members departed from the scene in private automobiles," which told him that they were therefore people of some social standing in Mobile. Armbrecht obviously didn't think that this was the case of the lawless element from the county. He didn't think they rode in from Pritchard to lynch this young man. In response, the Attorney General was rather casual about it, and he said, "I will refer it to the Postmaster General for appropriate action." On February 3rd, 1909, the Postmaster General detailed Postal Inspector O.J. Clark, who was in Chicago, to Mobile. Clark arrived by train in Mobile 2 days later and huddled immediately with Armbrecht and then launched his investigation. The Attorney General just flat out ignored Armbrecht's request for Justice Department agents being assigned to this case. Traveling on his own dime a few days later to Washington, Armbrecht personally lobbied the Attorney General for additional investigative personnel, but to no avail. Meanwhile, just as Armbrecht predicted, the local investigation of Robertson's lynching proceeded at a somewhat snail's pace. Mayor Pat Lyons' police commission and a grand jury subpoenaed Sheriff Frank Cassilas, several deputies, and police officers. All these men raised their right hands, testified under oath without legal counsel available, and said that they had no prior knowledge of a lynching plot and reported seeing no unusual crowds or activity near the jail on January 22nd or 23rd. By the way, this is totally contrary to everything you read in the newspaper. Back in those days, this is when we had a real newspaper in 1909. Those newspaper stories were extremely detailed about what was going on the street. And there were mobs gathering throughout the city on the 22nd and 23rd of January. This is what the grand jury and the police commission ruled. Without placing responsibility on any individuals for the crime, they ruled that the sheriff's deputies and the police were, quote, careless in their duties. This language required a great deal of irony in the days to come. About this time, state officials began to move into the case. The state attorney general ordered Mobile County Solicitor Nicholas Stallworth to gather any available evidence warranting impeachment of the sheriff. Stallworth immediately conferred with the local Citizens Reform Committee headed by Irwin Craighead, again, and Joseph Carlos Rich on the right. Just to show you what a small town Mobile was in 1909, Joseph Carlos Rich then promptly went over to visit with his good friend Will Armbrecht. So the bottom line here is that Armbrecht, a federal official, provided state officials with as much evidence as he could without jeopardizing his ongoing postal investigation. In early March 1909, Governor B.B. Comer ordered impeachment proceedings against Sheriff Frank Cassilas. He ordered them to begin at the end of April. And let me interject here. B.B. Comer hated Mobile with a passion. He thought this was the Sodom and Gomorrah of the state, mainly because people here ignored his prohibition laws. They ignored his blue laws, which prevented playing of baseball on Sunday, or going to movies on Sunday, going to Monroe Park on Sunday. So B.B. Comer had a lot of reasons for launching an impeachment of the sheriff. And quite frankly, I don't think the lynching was at the top of his list of reasons why he didn't like Mobile. And that tells you a lot about the time that we're talking about. And then on March 17th, you remember the postal inspection, Mr. Clark filed his final report on the threatening letters. He devoted 3 weeks to the case here in Mobile, and most of his report was devoted to his frustration over the fact that the Justice Department personnel were never assigned to make any investigation whatsoever. Clark's interviews with the Reverend McNeil revealed that the minister had also received several threatening letters and postcards during the previous 6 months, all in the same handwriting as the alleged mob leaders. These earlier letters attacked McNeil's public criticism of the police and sheriff's department for not enforcing prohibition in Mobile. Therefore, Clark felt that the letter writer was probably just some opponent of the liquor law, since it does not seem likely that the leader of a mob would write a letter admitting himself to be such. He further said he had ascertained beyond a doubt that one J.T. Jett, that's J-E-T-T, whom Armbrecht suspected of being the leader, was at home in bed at the time of the lynching and had no part in it. Now, the conclusion of the postal inspector is very interesting. He recommended closing the case because he felt like it lacked, quote, sufficient evidence or sufficient importance. But then he concluded with these words: state authorities know exactly who killed the Negro, but they can find no one who will go before the grand jury and admit that he knows anything concerning the matter. That was the end of the postal inspection. So with that closed, all the attention focused on the impeachment trial of the sheriff. The impeachment team was led by Nicholas Stallworth and Palmer Pillins, which is what leads me to believe that Palmer Pillins had been deeply involved in the information gathering long before the Attorney General of the state asked him to serve on the prosecuting team. Stallworth and Pillins called over 70 witnesses to testify, many of whom spoke of widespread rumors on January 22nd that Robertson's lynching was imminent. Their most compelling witness proved to be attorney James H. Webb. After hearing the same rumors all over the city, Webb telephoned the sheriff and warned him to take appropriate action and precautions to protect his prisoner. Cassilas brushed off the warning and responded that he was in a brand new, modern, secure jail and it could withstand any mob attack. The rumors continued throughout the afternoon, and James Webb personally visited the sheriff and inferior court judge Jules Alford and told them the prisoner would be lynched, quote, as sure as gun is iron. Webb's pleas again fell on deaf ears. Cassilas's defense attorneys, Greg Smith and Frank Inge, produced several good character witnesses and letters attesting to the sheriff's integrity, courage, loyal service to Mobile County, and to the Confederacy. They actually injected the Confederate service issue into this case too. Palmer Pillins, 60 years later, noted that was substantially all they had. They did the best they could with it. On June 3rd, 1909, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled 5-2. And you know, from our vantage point, it's hard to understand where the 2 came from. 5-2 to impeach Sheriff Cassilas for his gross negligence of duty, failure to protect his prisoner from the vigilantes. Pillins, in his memoirs, said the evidence provided no suggestion of complicity on the sheriff's part himself with the lynching. And further in his memoirs, Pillins says the sheriff was a scapegoat. And he probably was, because he may have been the only member of the Mobile Sheriff's Department that didn't either participate in the lynching or at least witness it. Moreover, just to show you how passive-aggressive Mobile was then, Cassilas's status as a sort of enfeebled Confederate veteran who was hard of hearing played into the testimony. And after the decision came down, Pillins, Stallworth, Rich, and the new sheriff, John Drago, petitioned the governor to relieve the elderly sheriff of his sizable legal fees. For 35-year-old Will Armbrecht, the impeachment trial undoubtedly left him with mixed emotions. Like many Mobilians, he firmly believed that sheriff's deputies and policemen had lynched Robertson in retaliation for their friend's murder. And he also understood that the so-called respectable citizens were in a large crowd that night. They had witnessed the crime, but would never testify in court. His ingenious attempt to prosecute the guilty parties for violating postal laws foreshadowed similar legal strategies employed by the Justice Department over 50 years later during the modern civil rights era. At the very least, he hoped that his postal investigation would identify the killers and yield evidence the state officials could use against the mob. He didn't quite achieve that goal, but there's no doubt that his evidence significantly contributed to the impeachment and removal of Frank Casselass from his position. And it sent a powerful, symbolic message to future sheriffs in Mobile County and across the state that they had to protect their prisoners. Now, let me show you a few pictures of the latter part of Will Armbrecht's career and make a few comments about his life, and then we'll try to get a few questions. He returned to his private law practice in 1911. This is one of the most famous pictures of him. This was taken when Woodrow Wilson came to town in the fall of 1913. And Will Armbrecht is sitting at Wilson's right. The arrow is pointing toward Will. And these were all of the people at this table were either members of the Chamber of Commerce or city government in Mobile. You can't see it from the very back, but if you look at this picture really close up, it looks like Will is really enjoying himself. You know, those days when he wouldn't be allowed to sit down at the table with such prominent people because he was a, quote, Yankee with a Yankee father, those days were gone by 1913 as the Republican U.S. attorney, or former U.S. attorney, sat down with a Democratic president. You know, this is not a very good copy of this picture. The Armbrecht family has a much better one, but this is the one I've got. This was taken probably in the 1920s, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong here, but probably in one of his law offices over in the First National Bank building, the old First National Bank building, right along here on Royal. That'd be my guess. But he had a number of partners over the years. I won't give you the entire history of the different law firms he was affiliated with, but you know, one way to sum it up is he laid the foundation for several prominent law firms in Mobile, including Armbrecht, Jackson, DeMuy, Crowe, Holmes, and Reeves, among several others that I could mention, including several Inges too. Who were his clients when he was a lawyer? And I'm going to get to these postcards in a minute. They included people like John Cochran, the bridge is named after, the Waterman Steamship Company, and various maritime and utilities in Alabama and Mississippi. He was a founding member of the Mobile Downtown Rotary Club in 1914. He was a Mason. He was a member of the Athelstan Club. But he also found time to serve several times as a vestryman at All Saints Episcopal Church. If you believe the printed material about him, and I'm very leery of this, most of the printed material says his primary hobbies were golfing, reading, and listening to the radio. And does that sound about right to the Armbrecht? During the rest of his life, when not practicing law, he devoted much of his time and energy to a variety of civic causes for the betterment of Mobile. By the way, these cards here were sent to his mother and different family members when he took a grand European tour with his wife, Anna, in 1937 to Germany, where his father, of course, had been born, France, Italy. Notice, just for future reference, notice the postmark on the two German postcards. If you'll notice the swastika. By 1937, the Nazi takeover, of course, of Germany and Austria and other countries in Europe was well underway, but he did not even mention anything about the politics or anything like that was going on in Germany. They were very light, happy postcards about, you know, touring. Here's some more postcards from Italy and France. And Hudson McDonald, the stamp collector sitting back there, is coveting these cards, but these are just copies, Hudson. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing, late in the 1930s, he began to correspond with Herbert Hoover, the former president, This is a sample of one of the letters that he wrote to Hoover in the late 30s, essentially agreeing with Hoover's America First ideas that we should not be drawn into the European war. I really haven't found any evidence of exactly why he became so outspoken about these things. You know, the imaginary side of being a historian makes me want to think that perhaps he spent a lot of long afternoons talking with his father when he was a boy. His father was seriously wounded during the Civil War, and he carried a wound that affected him for the rest of his life. I like to think maybe possibly that father had an influence on Will Armbrecht's attitude toward combat. But that's just speculation, and that's all it is. This is a picture, once again, all of these pictures, the Armbrecht family is kind enough to let me have. Some have said that during the latter part of his life, he began to look like the TV political personality George Will. And I won't name which Armbrecht who said that, but you know, I think there's some truth to that if you've seen George Will on television. The other thing is, the Armbrecht family has tons of speeches that Will delivered. And from everything that I've heard about him, he became one of the most popular after-dinner speakers in Mobile in the 1930s, yet he didn't read those speeches. He apparently had something resembling a photographic memory, as best I can tell. After a very brief illness, he died on July 10th, 1941 at age 67. He didn't live to see the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. So I'm always wonder if his, as many America First people felt, once the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, they more or less got rid of those views. But of course, since he didn't live, we don't know. Now, let me wrap all this up with this. Why did I choose a relatively brief moment in Will Armbrecht's life and career to highlight today? There are a lot of things we could have talked about. And why dredge up the unpleasant details of a lynching that occurred over 100 years ago, albeit just a stone's throw from us? In the Robertson case, Armbrecht had no statutory obligations to do anything at all. He could have sent Reverend McNeil right on back to St. Francis Methodist and said, take those nasty letters with you. Yet I think because of his reverence for the rule of law and his desire to see the guilty punished at great personal risk to himself and his family, he pushed this case as far as he could. He exhibited great personal courage at a time when it was in short supply in Mobile. And I'll leave you with these words from the great poet Maya Angelou, who wrote these words in 1993. History, despite its retching pain, cannot be unlived, and if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Thank you. And you know, if you've got any questions, we can do those now, or I'll be here afterwards and we can talk. So, Scotty, you want to? Yes, sir.
What was that clash between Robertson and the lawman all about? And was he dead when he was tried?
No, he was still alive. That was one piece of factual material that the coroner's jury actually got right. That he was severely wounded. He was first wounded in the shootout. I'll get back to that in a minute. And then he was shot 3 times with a 44 caliber pistol, which is a severe load, believe me. And but he was still alive when they put the rope around his neck. So the rope broke his neck and he died from the broken neck. Now, why he was in jail in the first place? First of all, there's some fascinating newspaper stories you need to go back and read in the Mobile Register for that time in January, the day that the Deputy Sheriff Philip Fatch was killed and his partner McCarran was wounded. Robertson had been working on a house on Oslava Street. He was a carpenter, and apparently had never been in any trouble with the law whatsoever. He had 2 grown children. His wife had died, so he's essentially living by himself. He got into an altercation with a plumber and a plumber's helper over on Slava Street. And they swore out a warrant against him for abusive language and threatening behavior. And so the deputy sheriffs were serving these papers on Robertson for these charges of these 2 plumbers that he had gotten into a fight with. So Robertson claimed, when he took him to jail later, that he started shooting at the deputies because he thought they were the alleged plumbers that were coming back to hurt him. It's just a case of one person's word against another. But as soon as the deputies showed up, they were in a buckboard. As soon as they got down from the buckboard, the shooting began on Slava Street, and there was something like 100 shots exchanged between the deputies and Robertson, he also had a .44 caliber pistol, which was readily available. It was almost like a Saturday night special in 1909. Everybody had one, or at least a .38, on them or in their house. And so they found on him 100 rounds of ammunition too. So Robertson was prepared to shoot it out. He shot Philip Fatch in the stomach from about 25 yards away. He wounded McCarran in the ankle, which was not life-threatening, obviously. Fatch continued to shoot. He shot Robertson once under the left shoulder, hit him also in the chest up here, high up here, and then I think also hit him in the leg. So Fatch and McCarran both continued to shoot even after they were wounded. Fatch was bleeding profusely. His partner knew it. He threw him in the buckboard. By that time, the city police had arrived on Slava Street. They then took Robertson, put him in the buckboard. They loaded that whole bunch on the buckboard, took them to Central Police Headquarters, and by then a mob had already started to form, and this was the day before the lynching occurred. Philip Fatch called for his children to be with him. He was a very devout Catholic. They brought in the Archbishop. He gave him the last rites, and Philip Fatch died that night, and a mob continued to form outside the infirmary where he was being kept. He was operated on for about 8 hours. But that's what the whole case was about. The Mobile Press Register or Daily Register tells the story much better than I can. But in comparison to the way they write stories now, I think you'll find this one quite fascinating. January 21st or 22nd, 1909, you can look at it in local history. So I probably gave you more information there than you wanted, but anything else? Okay. Thanks again. It's very nice having all of y'all. Look forward to you coming to the next learning.